Hey everyone, back again for another video. So, as you can see by my big old box of ATF here, we are going to be putting the transmission and the converter up in the Supra. So, let me see if I can put this down. Oh, perfect. Alright, so if you remember in the last video this car was featured in, we went ahead and put the converter adapter up in it. So, now that that's done, it's time to actually put the converter on the transmission, put the transmission back up in the car, and get all that squared away. So, I now have a shifter cable bracket, a dipstick, and a bunch of Type F ATF. So, have transmission, have converter, everything is ready to go up in. A few details about this transmission. It's a pretty nice piece. It's a reed case turbo 400, all billet parts on the inside, billet high gear drum, cone pump, billet center support. It's a Trans Specialties 210 gear set. I believe it's an Extreme Automatics clean neutral valve body with an internal trans brake solenoid, yada yada. And bear in mind, I am not a subject matter expert on these transmissions at all, but I know enough to be dangerous in what my trans builder told me. So, it is a nice piece, kind of a no expense spared deal, and there we are with that. The converter is one that I am borrowing from a good buddy of mine, and it is a Pro Torque. It was built in 2012. I have the spec sheet for it. The spec sheet, it reads like German to me. But this converter was built for my friends at Accelerated Performance all that time ago for a setup that will be relatively similar to what is in my car. So it should work. The biggest thing with it is I didn't want to spend thousands of dollars on a converter at this point in time. So if it isn't exactly quite right, whatever, it's something that will get the car moving, and I can always change it out or have it modified from there. So beyond that, I went down to Home Depot and got some bolts to hold the converter onto the converter adapter, and obviously got a box of Type F ATF. So all that said, we can begin this process, which hopefully won't be terribly cumbersome to get all this squared away, but you can get the old fluid drained out of the converter, can put some new fluid in it, put it on the input shaft and the pump on the transmission, and at that point we should be ready to slide everything back up in. Now, considering that this converter, I don't exactly, or really at all, know the history on it, I didn't want to, at a minimum, use the fluid that was in it to go up in this and be part of my whole system. So, I'm going to drain this fluid out, put a quart of the new Type F ATF that I got into it, just for peace of mind. It shouldn't be an issue, but just to be safe. So, let's tip this guy upside down. Get some of this fluid out of there. And once this is done draining, we can go ahead, put our new quart in, and then slide this thing on the transmission. So now that we have the old fluid drained out of the converter, I'm going to take a quart of my new Type F and just dump it down in this, I guess. So, no spill. There we go. Hear it bubbling. And wait for it to drain down. It'll be kind of like filling an oil filter up, where you put a little bit, wait for it to level out, or wait for the level to go down, a little bit, level down, so on and so forth, until we empty this quart into the converter here. So it's going to take a little while. Check back with you guys in a couple minutes. So now, if you can see it down in there, we have fluid in the converter, and that means the next thing to do is to slide the converter up onto the input shaft and the snout of the pump. Now, one thing to note that I just noticed is we have these two notches in the front of the converter here. And let me grab my light. There are two corresponding notches, or two corresponding posts on the inside of the pump there, if you can see them. So those need to line up. If they don't line up, the converter won't slide the whole way back on the input shaft and the pump there, and the converter won't be seated correctly. So as you can see, I made a couple of permanent marker notations for myself, as I'm not a transmission guy. I can't just do this by eye easily. So that gives me a way to align the converter onto the front of the transmission here without having a ton of guesswork. So I'll go ahead, glove up, and get this converter thrown onto the front of the transmission here, hopefully without making a giant mess, and then we can move forward from there. Now we have the converter seated without making too much of a mess. Got some on my rag there, but that is why we have the rag. So I slide this back and slide myself around. You can see the converter sits recessed pretty far back in the bell housing. Now this is the slid back position for the converter. It sits back in that position so you can actually install all this up in the car. If it wasn't this way, it isn't easily pilotable like a input shaft on a clutch. So this needs to be slid back, and especially with those two posts that I just showed you guys to align the converter in there, that would be a nightmare to try to pilot it otherwise. So we do it this way, and now the converter's on there, and this whole deal is just about ready to go up in the car. We have a couple other things to do first. The first of those things is to tighten down the shift selector right here. So it has a rectangular hole on the top side here where my index finger is, and that corresponds to the flats on this post. It sits down here, and that gives you the ability to change gears that way with the transmission. So I have a washer and I have a nut. Need to tighten that down on there. And I also think I'm going to go ahead and put the actual cable guide onto the bottom of the pan right here. However, before I do that, these are both raw mild steel pieces. I'm going to throw a little bit of paint on them first, so that way to prevent just a little bit of rust and make it look a little bit more sightly. So I'll go ahead and get some paint on those, and then we can get started with installing the linkage on the side of the transmission. I have my shift bracket stuff painted on the ground here. Did a nice VHT roll bar and chassis satin black. That's my go-to paint for pretty much everything. I really like the finish that it provides, but these things are still a little bit wet. And I did figure out that I bought the wrong bolts for the converter to adapter plate setup. So I bought 1/2-inch bolts, and I need 7/16. So I'll have to run back down to the hardware store, get a few other bolts, a few other nylocks, washers, so on and so forth. And at that point, I'll be ready to bolt the converter to the adapter plate once everything is slid back up underneath the car. So I think I also need to get 2 more of these bolts, as these are what hold the transmission to the adapter plate on the back of the engine. I had 2 more, I don't know where they are, so I'll get 2 or 4 of those. If I can have a matching set, that would be pretty sweet. And at that rate, once I have all of my bolts, I can go ahead and put the linkage brackets on the side of the transmission. I can probably put the dipstick tube in at that point too, and slide everything up underneath the car, bolt it in, and we should be pretty close to good at that point, aside from fastening the converter to the adapter. So I'll be back in a bit once I get those fasteners and we can keep moving forward with this project. Well, I am back with my bag of fasteners and we are ready to put this transmission up in the car, but not until I put those brackets on the side of it. So paint should be dry at this point, I hope at least. So let me go ahead, I'll throw those on the side and then we can begin getting this back up in the car. So the car is in position to reinstall the transmission. And I'm sure you noticed, but I like to use this hydraulic cart that I modified to make this a little bit easier without using a transmission jack. I actually think it's a little bit easier than using a transmission jack. So the cart obviously will raise up and down, but if you see these leveling feet on either side of it, I can actually tip the cart one way or another to help align it, as sometimes, you know, with the way that things are mounted, the trans may need to kick one way or another to line up with any dowel pins or anything like that. So we are ready to go to put this back in. The car is in a good position for me to slide underneath. So all I need to do is get it a little bit more lined up, slide under there, do so. Then I can play with my leveling feet, I can raise it up in, and we can start fastening this transmission back in the car. After some sweat equity paid to the car there, we have the trans and converter back up in. So, went ahead and got my bolts. Everything's tight there. Obviously you can see the converter in place, adapter plate, all that happy stuff there. And I just went ahead and slid the dipstick back in its home, as I needed to remove it to get the trans up in there. It was binding up in an odd spot, so it's easier to pull it out and reinstall later. So I need to drop the car back down and fasten the dipstick to the firewall. And at that point, aside from these two fittings on the side of the transmission case here, and then running the shifter linkage to the bracketry here, we're done with this install. So I'm going to wait for the shift cable, it's words, wait for the shift cable, put that in at another point in time, and I will wait and figure out how I'm going to run the lines for those two ports on the side of the case. But for now, we'll drop the car down, fasten the dipstick, and call this a done deal. And now with the dipstick installed, and it still has a bit of play right there so it won't rub through, that is a wrap for this project, at least for today. I didn't throw the drive shaft back in, as frankly, as you can see by the sweat on my forehead, I'm hot, I'm done for the day. So pretty happy with the progress overall. Got the converter in, got the trans in. That's one big step forward and a few less parts laying around. So that makes me very happy. So the next order of business will be to throw the drive shaft in, get the exhaust back up under there. I have a little bit of additional clearancing to do on the exhaust, which again, sweat on the forehead, not doing it today. But this thing is actually coming along. It's not terribly far from running, but with the house, we'll see what I can swing in regards to other parts and the remaining bits required to get this thing up and operational again. So I think that's going to wrap it up for this video. And as always, be sure to subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment, and we'll see you next time.